as Simon said, learning D3 is really hard. Like I said, I was lucky enough to join a team where they said, hey, learn D3, but I still banged my head against the desk for 6 months before I understood this whole enter, update, exit thing. And during that time, the primary way to learn about D3 and the community and anything was on the mailing list, the Google groups. So a few of us said, hey, let's get together. Is anybody else in San Francisco? It'd be nice to talk to someone face to face and like confirm that I'm not the only crazy one trying to learn this. And so we started the Bay Area D3 meetup, and we hold an annual Unconf now. We've had 2. You should check that out if you haven't been. We'll hold it again later this year. And and since then, Simon's taken up the mantle for Oakland. We have every Tuesday for the last year and some change. 2 years now. Oh, wow. So yeah, now we have a vibrant community here and what I'm calling an ecosystem, because there's just so much stuff out there. It feels organic. It's kind of been hard to put your finger at any single source of information or examples or every time someone asks me how do I get started with D3, I feel like I give a different set of links. So I'm trying to make this talk and this set of slides as a way to introduce people to the ecosystem, or if you're already introduced, kind of put the stuff in some kind of order and hopefully show you some new stuff. And finally, I think we'll get to something which is namely the ability to search that lets, every day I find new stuff basically now, and I hope you will start finding too. So this idea of an ecosystem, I think, starts with if, some of the most prolific users of D3. So you obviously all know who Mike Bostock is, the creator of D3. He's made a ton of amazing graphics for the New York Times. He made blocks.org, and his blocks page has, this is really the first starting point I point everyone to, and I think a lot of people also go to. You just infinite scrolling D3 magic. Some of it really feels like magic if you try to read the code. Don't feel bad. It's elegant to a fault, but beautiful. And so sort of, I think Mike set the standard and sort of set an example for everybody in terms of making examples. You can see some of his other colleagues or previous colleagues, Sean Carter, worked at the New York Times, or works at the New York Times, I believe. Gregor Aish. These guys are making amazing stuff and a lot of it. And, it's not just them. If you go to the official gallery, this is also just, you can scroll for a long time. All these different charts, visualizations, examples people have made using D3, doing all kinds of really cool stuff. And it can feel overwhelming, right? Once people got tired of making thumbnails, they just keep adding links, just because there's that much. So you send someone to this page, and maybe if you're, particularly curious or bored one day, you might actually click on all these and you won't, it's kind of like Wikipedia, you just keep clicking and it stays interesting. But if you sort of have a deadline or you're trying to learn something particular for your project, you may not have the luxury of just, getting lost on the internet like we sometimes do. So yeah, where do we start? But before we start, I want to touch on something that I think comes up very often, both from people new to D3 as well as people who find it because they're looking for something particular, which is a charting library. And I want to kind of distinguish the concept of D3 and the concept of a charting library, because D3 is not a charting library. People more eloquent than myself have talked about this, and I can point you to some talks, but to summarize, the idea is that a charting library, you basically say, okay, I have these standard sets of charts, bar chart, line chart, maybe there's been some new ones that D3 has made possible to kind of encapsulate, like the chord diagram or a Sankey diagram. But at the end of the day, there's over 50 different chart libraries and counting. Christoph Viau has compiled a list, and he's even dated when they were last worked on. But the idea here is that there's a lot, and I think the reason is that a charting library is kind of the wrong abstraction, or at least it's not the interesting abstraction. It might be nice if you just need a line chart and a bar chart and a scatter plot to be able to pull something off the shelf. But man, I got up in my singing game, I think. I'm not hitting the notes. All right, so these charts I'm not saying they're not useful, and I'm not discouraging anyone from creating your own charting library. I think there's, if 50 other people can do it, you can too. But I think the real power of D3 is not in making charts. It's in making custom graphics. It's in creating the interactions, the transitions, the animations. It's in expressing the data you have as a dynamic document, which I've written some stuff here, which I'll try not to read out loud, but D3 stands for data-driven documents, right? So the whole idea of D3 is that it's more of a tool belt or a toolkit where you can pick and choose the tools you need for a given job, right? So it's not just a hammer and everything looks like a nail. When you have these charts, you can do really intricate custom work, or you can automate some things that would otherwise be tedious. I'll try to show more examples of this as we go on. For those of you who are getting started and are trying to learn, and for whatever reason whatever your background, I've noticed, over these years, people come from design, seeing what D3 can do, and saying, I want to be able to make my stuff, behave like that. Or if you're coming as an analyst who's familiar with data and SQL or scripting or whatever it may be, and you want to see your data in a new way. Or as someone who already codes, maybe you're a front-end engineer or back-end engineer, and you now want to put some stuff on the web for your team or expose something to your customers. People come from all these different backgrounds, but there's basically one starting point I point everybody to, which is Scott Murray's Introduction to D3. And that is because this tutorial is one long series that, this is the About page. It goes over sort of all the fundamental pieces that D3 ties together. And I think it's really well written, really easy to consume, because D3 is a JavaScript library, right? But it's basically helping you by making certain mathematical things easier for you that might come in useful in data visualization, or certain mapping stuff. And it's all these functions but they, at the end of the day, they all just touch on HTML and CSS. So and SVG is sort of a part of HTML, right? So it's tying these things together. So it's way more expressive than what can I put in a box with two axes. It's what can I do with HTML and CSS, which, as we all know, is a whole lot. So that's sort of the starting point. If you aren't comfortable with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and how those all tie together, if you've done some jQuery in the past, I think this is also a great place to kind of brush up, because you're probably familiar with a lot of the concepts. But yeah, so I think that's a great starting point. Another couple good starting point is Curran Kelleher's videos. He actually just moved to India, but he was here for a while, and he's given it several talks, and is really good at D3 and also really good at explaining it. So this YouTube video has a lot of views. It's sort of an hour-long overview, and it does take you through building all the basic charts. So even though I don't advocate for charting libraries, it can be good to practice knowing, making something that you know how it should look when you're done with it. And he does a great job sort of taking you through all the concepts. And he also recently did a nice talk. This is the second video here that has these interactive slides that it's more of a data visualization talk than a D3 particular one, but he has D3 examples that are behind, I think it's below all this. He goes over all these different kinds of charts, and then he has code examples written in D3 that you could actually see how these principles, these fundamental principles are implemented. So, you know, getting the basics, getting a handle on what you can do, what's just going on here is one step, right? And you have to do that regardless, you know, of how you're coming into this, and regardless of your background in web development. But once you have that, I think this is where D3's ecosystem starts coming into play, and where things start getting more interesting. And I really, really recommend anybody getting a D3 or who is into D3 and hasn't seen it to watch this talk by Mike Bostock on, it's called For Example. And actually, you may not even want to watch it. You can just read it, because it's a really long, like the entire talk is transcribed with the examples in line. And they're all interactive, and they all have code behind them. So you can really lose a Saturday on this, or an evening, or a week, I don't know. I mean, it's just really amazing. But I'll sort of just summarize the central thrust of it, which is it's a really good idea to make examples. And not just if you're an expert and you're telling everybody how it is, but if you're trying to learn something, if you're trying to understand what's happening, make yourself a little example to try to get a handle on this new concept that you're looking into, and then share that. I mean, you may not be proud, you may be nervous, but if you get that example and then you can get it into somebody else's hands to give you feedback, I mean, that's how the Stack Overflow stuff works, right? That's how we do on the mailing list and in Slack now, is that people make an example of whatever they're stuck on, and then other people will jump in and help and clarify, you know, what you might have been confused about, or might point you into interesting directions to look at. Or they might even take your example and rework it a little bit and show you how they would have done it. So this whole essay is a bunch of examples of that working out for Mike and his team at the New York Times, like how they solve different pretty interesting and complex problems by isolating them into these smaller examples so they could try a new technique or fix some issue. And I think the results kind of speak for themselves. Let me go over that. All right, so the next thing I want to do, well, let me just take a breath. I always want to talk too fast. Does anyone have any questions yet? Yes?
Is the community on Stack Overflow like for D3s?
I think it's pretty active. I haven't been on it as much personally lately, but I did this one thing where I subscribed to. So this is sort of a pro tip as well for learning. When I was starting out with D3, I basically tried to answer as many questions on the D3 mailing list as I could. Not because I knew D3 better than other people, but because trying to solve these isolated problems was actually a really good way to practice these new concepts, right? If I thought I understood how something worked, but when I tried someone else's thing that they set up and I couldn't make it work, or once I finally did, I got a new perspective on how that worked. So answering people's questions, especially, and you know, in the D3 Stack Overflows, people are encouraged to post a code sample on a block or maybe a JS bin or something. It can be a really great environment to try out your skills, right, without necessarily having to commit to a whole project or get in too deep. So yeah, it's a good place. And I subscribe to the D3.js tag, and so every morning it emails me like there are 20 new questions and stuff. So there's definitely a lot of questions on there. I believe there's a lot of answers. But yeah, it's a good place. And then Slack and the mailing list are still pretty vibrant too. Yeah. Any other questions before I go deeper? All right, so I've been talking about how great I think examples are and um, how important they are to our community. But I think we should go through we should try it ourselves or see for ourselves what it's like. So if you haven't done any D3 development, this will be kind of a preview of what your life may look like. And if you have, hopefully this reflects your reality as well. So one part of that reality is that you will always have this tab open or multiple tabs like this. I'm just like randomly clicking on stuff. Right? So this is the D3 documentation, the API reference. And if you notice something about all of these is that it's very clean. It's got code, but it's very minimal. If you actually start reading some of this, I'm not sure what the right adjective is, but it's kind of terse, like scientific almost, in that it says exactly what it needs to say and nothing more and nothing less. And if you know what it's talking about, if you're already comfortable with HSL, let's say, choosing a random example, then that's fine. But if you're not comfortable with that subject, if you're not comfortable with the concept of easing yet, it can be a little bit hard to piece things together. So what you really want on top of this, like this is great reference if you're reading some code or you're looking up some technique and you see, oh, how do I use this? What are the parameters? That's great. But really what we want is to see examples of how to use something. So one thing most people have probably seen is a force layout diagram. Let me close these ones I'm not using. Okay, so this is a document for the force layout diagram, right? And there's some cool examples. Force layouts, right, allow you to lay out a data set. Often it's a network data set. Let me see if yeah, this is not particularly useful, but it's pretty cool. This is more what you're probably used to seeing, where you have this sort of network where you have nodes and they're linked together, and the force layout allows you to lay them out using sort of a physics model that generally ends up in a pretty nice configuration. And not only that, it's dynamic, so you can reposition stuff. And this layout has a ton of ways you can use it. It has a lot of methods. We just scroll, scroll, scroll. This is all the stuff that the force layout can do. There's a lot going on. And it so happens that I did choose one aspect of D3 that does have some nice examples linked in the documentation. And I'm going to choose one that I already chose, which is this. And this is sort of a fairly common thing people will want to do. Let me see if I have it linked conveniently. I don't right now. What was it? So I'm trying to find an example where this technique was used in the New York Times. It was the, might have been this one. Yeah. I can just Google this one. So this one's really cool, right? You have this complex data concept of the United States budget, and here we can dynamically switch between scatter plots, whatever kind of unit chart this is, and the force layout. But here we have the force layout where there's sort of coalescing on two different foci, like focal points. And so this is an example of how to do that without the whole data viz, without all the copy of the New York Times. There's just this little bit of code that powers that. So this could be an interesting example to look at if that's what you want to do. Now, it just so happens that, like I said, that was part of this, that was one of these, multiple foci. And Simon hinted at this earlier in the evening, but, you know, it's one thing to see this example, but it's another thing to be able to play with it and try to, you know, bend it to fit your use case, or to poke at it so you see if you could understand it, right? So the tool that I made recently is called blockbuilder. And the way it works is you can take any block, like let's say, oops, any URL, I didn't mean to click that. And you just replace blocks.org with blockbuilder.org. And this is going to load that same code and render it the same way. But now you can edit that code over here. So I have a code editor. And I'm going to first reduce the amount of time between each one shooting out. And then the other thing is I want to understand, okay, how do these focal points work? I see there's something called foci here, and there's XY coordinates, so that it's probably something about these focal points. And then down here there's this code which looks like some gnarly math, which maybe, you know, it involves the foci, so maybe we want to see how that works. So with blockbuilder, you can click on numbers and we can change like the Y attribute. So now this cluster is a little higher up, right? Or we can move it over. So now it's more in the middle. Move this one over to the right. Oh. Right, so you can play with those. Yeah, and the idea being that, you know, you don't have to download this code, run it in a local like your own browser, start a simple server. It's just right here in the browser. You can click. If I was proud of this, let's say, and or I was like, hey, why doesn't this work? The thing I changed, I could fork it, and I'll just go ahead and do that for this example. And that will make a new copy of what I made. And since I was logged in, it will be on my GitHub account. And I could then share this link with everybody, or with somebody in particular, saying, hey, can you help me out with why, you know, why is this one way over here? Why are these grouped over here? And someone else could then edit it or play with it, see what's going on themselves, and fork it, send it back to me. So this is sort of a new development in the community. It makes it much easier and much quicker to create examples and to edit and share them. So what we've seen is actually a lot more blocks being made. And so now our problem of you know, not knowing where to start is actually almost worse. Like we have more examples to get through. So something I've been working out with some people is search. Okay. So let's say we want to find all the force layout examples there are. This is an index. Actually, let me close this. So there's actually, as far as we know, there's 11,000 blocks out there. We're cataloging them by keeping track of all the public blocks that people post, and we have over 1,000 GitHub usernames that we're aware of have posted at least one public block. So that's a lot of examples to look through. And so this feature of blockbuilder, the idea is we could, you know, just look for awesome visualizations maybe. There's 109 awesome blocks. But, you know, maybe more practically, we want to find stuff for a specific function. So this is d3.layout.force. So what we've done is we've parsed out all the API calls from each of the blocks, and we can filter them explicitly. So there's 497 blocks that we know of that use a force layout in some way. And you know, clicking on any of these will open up that example in blockbuilder, and we can look at it, see the code, all that good stuff. So this hopefully is a powerful new way for people to, for you guys, myself as well, to find the kind of things you're looking for. Because another example that I've seen come up again and again on the mailing list is people, they like the force layout, but then their labels keep overlapping, right? So if I search for labels in force layout, you can see various people's attempts at laying out labels using the force, right? So this is a demo where they actually parameterize this a little bit to demonstrate that technique. Or I think this looks like Mike made one where you hide the labels unless you mouse over them. So there's a ton of these that you could look through. Another kind of cool thing is that the default search page is all the latest blocks. So it's everything most recently created. So some of these were made today or yesterday, and it updates every 15 minutes. So Mike recently made something cool, probably worth watching, definitely. So I want to give maybe one more or one or two more other examples of how you might use the search. And for instance, actually, I recently helped out a friend who wanted to do a circle pack layout. As a designer, she knew she wanted this layout. She had data in the spreadsheet, and she wanted to get from her spreadsheet into this layout. So the first thing, of course, we did was look for, let me just do it here. So there's the pack layout. So you can find all the different examples that show using the pack layout. But her data, the canonical examples, and if you look at the pack layout tutorials, they have data in a format that did not match hers. It was already sort of hierarchical. So hierarchy being like there's a parent and then children data, right? So something like this is a basic circle packing thing, right? Each circle is a new level of the hierarchy, and you go deeper and deeper. But the data, let's see. See, the data is already in that format. There's something, and then children, and then that has children, and that has children. And so you get if you have a flat CSV, you have to transform your CSV into a data format that looks like this. And so what we want to do is find an example of that, not only layout.pack, but also nest. So now these examples are the subset that use both the circle pack and the nest, and so now it turns out that there's actually a good example of that from Elijah Meek's book D3JS in Action, which I recommend. A lot of the examples from the book are already in blocks, but this helped us sort of find the example we needed and adapt it to her data and the design she wanted. So you can also just search for simple. You might find simple examples. I thought that was kind of interesting. Some of them don't look very simple, though. Your mileage may vary. Oops. Oh no, I broke this link. All right, so that's enough examples of searching. I think another talk also by Mike that I would highly recommend watching if you get a chance is Mike Bostock's Visualizing Algorithms. So this is a little bit less about data viz or even D3 in particular, but it's really interesting concepts. And a lot of people have since decided that they would also like to visualize algorithms, try to make sense of them. And so if you search for algorithm and blocks, you can find other people. I mean, a lot of these were made by Mike, but a lot of them also weren't. So it's kind of interesting to be able to search through examples. One thing I've been seeing come up a lot is genome. So I think someone's actually doing like a class or assignment thing on this Genome Browser thing. But you can start searching for topical stuff. You know, if you, let's say you want to make time series. Maybe you want to, oops, spell it like this. So you can find people that have made something related to time series. So yes, those are most of the examples I wanted to show, and I just want to plug a couple of posts I've written recently, which may be interesting for you if you're starting to navigate the ecosystem. So I interviewed several prominent and prolific D3 users on how they started learning D3 and wrote it up here. And then I also wrote up how the search works and the data behind it. I'm actually really looking forward to being able to visualize these results, since we know like who made the blocks, we know when they were made, we know the API functions. So if you're interested in anything like that, you should read this post. I actually have all 11,000 blocks and their code zipped up if you wanted to like parse the code itself. Stuff like that could be cool. Anyway, yeah, so that's what I have for now, and then happy to answer any questions. Yes. Yeah, so we're pulling out the hex, actually everything, RGB, HSL, hex, and converted it. Absolutely, and maybe I can find the example via search. I know who made it, but yeah, so Nadia Bremer made a self-organized map of all the colors of the block. So it's clustering, so the size of these. I think she had a couple of versions of this. Yeah, and this one, you could scale and unscale them. And I believe all the highlighted ones are colors that are included in D3 scales, like all these. Yeah, I like this scale kind. And then steel blue is highlighted in red because Mike used it so much. And yeah, so people are starting to do cool stuff with this data. I think Micah made it's not a good search term. He made one where he looked at all of the links between different blocks. So people that referenced various, and this is a large file it's loading. So if a README references another README, I'm not sure what's going on with these mouse overs. It's kind of cool looking though. So this is a forced layout of blocks and how they're related to each other. So if people forked one, so these in the middle here have all been forked from the same block and sort of spread. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on there. Any other questions? Is anyone like more lost than when we started? Yeah.
I'm really interested in like Baroque architectural trees that are and I haven't really seen any. I mean, I've looked through a lot of these and I haven't seen anything that quite approximates that. Like something simple as like two triangles with tangent points and an arc through them. I don't know what that
Yeah, so, man, Sima, do you remember a while ago someone gave a cool presentation on making geometric patterns here? We'll have to think back to that, but
I'll have to look at the archives.
yeah. There's definitely people doing interesting stuff with geometry, but nothing comes to mind in terms of where to start. Although somebody who everyone should know about anyway is Tom McWright. And I guess he makes a lot of gists regardless of whether they're blocks. But in the past, we used to do, there was this guy, Geometry Daily, this sweet Tumblr, where this guy makes like really cool geometry things every day. And then several people, we all challenged each other to like re-implement these in D3 as sort of practice and doing that, and kind of, it was also really interesting, 4 different people would implement one of these things, and you could take something like this, and each person would have a completely different implementation or technique, in terms of how they achieved it. So if you're interested in that, I mean, that was really fun. I'd totally do that again. And I think with the Slack now, there's much more real-time communication. We sort of did it over Twitter, and then it kind of fizzled out, but I'd love to try that with Slack around now. Yeah.
Is that Tumblr using processing?
No, he was using Illustrator.
Oh.
Yeah, so he did everything manually. And that was kind of the interesting thing about it, right? Is like his aesthetic choices, and then we tried to like match that by using D3. I can actually do it this way. Yeah, and anybody else? Yeah. Restrictions, as in? Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what are the most common sort of restrictions or limitations of D3? And I think that's kind of in line when you're checking it out, like, yeah, you're trying to evaluate, is this a good fit for what I'm trying to do, and is it not? So an interesting thing there is that D3 itself isn't necessarily limited in the way that you might think. So some people say, oh, well, how do I plot 1,000,000 points or do real-time updating, those kind of things. The interesting thing about D3 is it's just a thin wrapper around standard web technologies, right? So if you're trying to draw a whole lot of things and move them around a lot, you would probably use Canvas or maybe even Webgl as opposed to SVG. But D3 itself couldn't really care less about which of those you use. It's up to you sort of how you use them, right? Or I guess people ask, like, what's the size of the data? Well, there you're more constrained about the bandwidth that you're willing to, occupy. Is your user on mobile, or is the user on a desktop client, or what can the browser have in memory? So I think it actually helps to rephrase the problem, not so much in terms of what can D3 handle or not handle, it's just what are the limiting factors in the problem you're trying to address, and then it becomes more of an engineering problem. Because if you use some parts of D3 to do like the updating of and animating of things, then it's the same thing that like Facebook does when they decide how many DOM elements to show you on their page with React. Like the same. Ultimately, you can't show like update more than 40,000 elements or something without the browser crapping out. Yeah, so it's sort of a non-answer, at the same time as being an answer. Yeah.
Well, have you done work with 3D stuff?
With 3D and D3, a little bit. No one's paid me to do work with it, but I've had fun. So I played with some 3JS, which is sort of basics. I mean, it's sort of a, not basic, but a foundational tool that a lot of people use in doing D3. And recently I did play with something that I really enjoyed called A-frame. So A-frame is like a DOM element thing where it's made also for VR. So if we had all had our Oculuses on or whatever, we could get lost in this. But and then one of my ulterior motives, so I used to try to remake a bunch of optical illusions with D3 because I figured that's what an evil genius would do. And VR has like totally made that a much more plausible idea, so you can actually make people physically ill by writing code. And people have reported that from watching this bar chart roller coaster. So yeah, so this is all using D3. It's actually not very much code at all. Well, okay, there's more code because I added all this other crap to like show what I was doing. But you're essentially creating these DOM elements that are expressed as 3D elements. Maybe this one's less code, a little bit, because it's got labels. So basically, you just create a scene with DOM elements, and then I use D3 to enter, and I append these cubes, and then I set attributes on those cubes, like their position, rotation, width, and depth, and height. So that's been pretty cool. I think it's really promising. This is as far as I've gone, and there's definitely, I think we should search for Webgl. So there's been some Webgl blocks, and some people are doing some stuff there. It's still a little harder, I think, to integrate with D3 and Webgl, but
Well, Nod was working on PathGL.
right, PathGL. So yeah, I think this is still in development, but something interesting. Cool. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you for listening to me, and yeah, catch y'all later.